One quiet Sunday afternoon, a knock on the bathroom door changed everything, and I was not prepared for what happened next. It was a typical Sunday, the kind that lulls you into a false sense of calm. The sun was high in the sky, casting soft rays through the curtains of our small suburban home, creating a warmth that made everything feel just a bit too slow. Sundays had always been my day to unwind, to take a breather from the week and just escape into my thoughts or get lost in a video game, but this Sunday was different, though I didn't realize it at first. I headed to the bathroom after lunch, planning to stay in there for a while. You know how it is when you're just looking for a quiet moment to yourself. I liked to scroll through my phone, maybe play a game or two, and just enjoy the solitude. The bathroom had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could shut out the world and take a moment to breathe. Little did I know that what was supposed to be a regular, uneventful afternoon was about to take a turn. As I sat there scrolling through my phone, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. At first I didn't pay much attention. Our house was always full of little noises: the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of the TV in the living room. But there was something different about these footsteps, something deliberate. They were soft but purposeful, stopping just outside the bathroom door, and then came the knock. It wasn't an urgent knock, nothing that screamed "come out right now," but it was strange enough to make me pause. My mom's voice followed, sounding a bit too cheerful. "Hey sweetheart, you in there?" I frowned, glancing at the closed door. "Yeah mom, I'll be out in a minute." "All right," she replied, her voice still bright, a little too bright. "Take your time." I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway, and I went back to my phone, trying to brush off the odd interaction. My mom wasn't the type to check in on me in the bathroom. We weren't a family that needed constant updates on where we were or what we were doing, but today for some reason she felt the need to stop by and say hi through the door. Weird, but not worth overthinking, or so I thought. Minutes passed and a quiet returned. The house was still, save for the occasional sound of the wind brushing against the windows. I tried to relax, but something about that knock lingered in the back of my mind. My mom wasn't acting like herself. She hadn't done anything out of line, but the tone of her voice had struck me as off. I shook my head, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. Maybe she was just in a good mood, I told myself. Maybe she wanted to talk about something later, or maybe she was just checking in. But no matter how many explanations I came up with, I couldn't fully dismiss the strangeness of it. And then, just as I was starting to relax again, I heard her footsteps return. This time they were slower, more hesitant. My pulse quickened for reasons I couldn't explain. She was standing outside the door again. "But why? Everything okay in there?" Her voice came quieter this time, almost hesitant. Yeah," I replied, my voice cracking just slightly. "I'll be out soon." There was a pause, a beat of silence that stretched just a little too long before she responded, "All right." But she didn't move. I could hear her standing there just outside the door, and my heart started to pound in my chest. I had no idea why I felt so on edge, but there was no denying the tension building in the air. I stood up, glancing at myself in the mirror. I looked the same tousled hair, same hoodie, same everything, but the feeling in the room wasn't the same. There was something hanging in the air, something heavy and unsettling. After what felt like an eternity, I finally heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway again. I let out a breath. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my body, relaxing ever so slightly, but the unease didn't go away. I finished up in the bathroom, splashing some water on my face as if that would wash away the strange tension that had settled over me. The water felt cool against my skin, but it didn't do much to clear my head. With a towel wrapped around my waist, I opened the bathroom door and stepped into the hallway. Everything looked normal, the same old pictures on the walls, the same soft lighting filtering in through the windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like the air in the house had shifted ever so slightly. I walked down the hallway, my bare feet padding softly against the hardwood floor. I passed by my mom's room, the door closed as usual, and made my way to my own room at the end of the hall. But as I reached for the doorknob, I paused. Something caught my eye. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. My mom never went into my room without asking ever. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find her standing inside, but the room was empty. Everything was in its place: my bed neatly made, my clothes piled up on the chair in the corner, my desk a cluttered mess of papers and random stuff. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, my mom's perfume. It was subtle, barely there, but it was enough to confirm what I had already suspected. She had been in here, but why, and what had she been doing? I sat on the edge of my bed, my mind racing. Maybe she had just come in to tidy up, or maybe she needed something from my room, but that didn't make sense. She never did that, and the fact that she hadn't mentioned it when she knocked on the bathroom door earlier only made it more confusing. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why had she come into my room without saying anything? Why had she lingered outside the bathroom like that? And why did it feel like there was something she wasn't telling me? But the story didn't end there. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself replaying the events over and Over in my head, trying to make sense of the strange tension that had settled between us. Something was going on, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and as much as I wanted to brush it off as nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change drastically. The days following that strange encounter in the bathroom were anything but normal. There was a change in the air between me and my mom that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't like we had a falling out or some big argument, but there was an invisible line that seemed to have been crossed, and neither of us acknowledged it. I wasn't sure how to bring it up or if I should even try, but the tension, subtle yet unmistakable, lingered between us, almost like it was waiting for something. It started with small things like the way she'd watch me a little too closely when I walked into the room. I'd catch her staring only for her to quickly look away, pretending to be busy with something else, or how she seemed to be around more, always finding a reason to be in the same room as me. It felt like every time I tried to carve out some time for myself, she'd show up, sitting in the living room when I was there, cooking in the kitchen when I was grabbing a snack, or even folding laundry on the couch when I was playing video games. At first I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to coincidence. Maybe she just wanted to spend more time together, or maybe she had something on her mind and didn't know how to talk about it. But the more it happened, the more it became clear that it wasn't just random. There was an underlying reason, something neither of us was willing to confront. One evening we were sitting on the couch watching TV. The soft glow of the screen flickered in the dark living room, and the only sounds were the low hum of the show and the occasional clinking of the ice in her glass. I was trying to focus on the show, but my mind kept drifting back to the way she was sitting next to me, closer than usual, so close that I could feel the heat radiating from her body. My heart began to beat faster, and I couldn't figure out why. She didn't say much, just the occasional comment about the show, but every word she spoke seemed heavier, like there was something behind it. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, but all I could think about was the space between us, or rather the lack of space. My skin tingled every time her arm brushed mine, and I found myself wondering why I was suddenly so hyper-aware of every tiny movement she made. As the credits rolled and the show ended, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Maybe it was the tension of sitting so close for so long, but I was ready to get up to put some distance between us. I reached for the remote to turn off the TV, but before I could move she spoke. "You've really grown up," she said, her voice quiet, almost thoughtful. I paused, the remote still in my hand, unsure of to respond. "Yeah, I guess," I muttered, glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. She was looking at me in a way that made my stomach twist, like she was seeing me for the first time, not just as her son, but as someone else, someone older. There was a long silence after that, the kind that made my palms sweat. I wasn't sure what to say, and it felt like the wrong move to stay silent, but before I could think of something, she did something I didn't expect. Slowly she reached out and placed her hand on mine. It was a gentle touch, but it felt like a bolt of electricity shot through me. My breath caught in my throat, and my first instinct was to pull away, but I didn't. I couldn't. I just sat there frozen, my heart racing as her fingers curled slightly around mine. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. Her hand lingered for a moment longer before she slowly pulled it away, leaving a cold, empty feeling where her warmth had been. I finally exhaled, though my mind was spinning. "Thanks," I managed to say, though the words felt hollow. My eyes flicked back to the TV, but I wasn't really seeing it anymore. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I could feel her watching me, her eyes tracing every inch of my face, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. Not after that. She stood up abruptly, breaking the silence that had settled over us like a heavy blanket. "I'm going to bed," she said, her voice back to its usual tone. It was almost like nothing had happened, like we hadn't just crossed a line that neither of us knew how to navigate. "Good night," I replied, still staring at the screen, still trying to process everything. As soon as I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway, I let out a breath. I didn't realize I had been holding. My mind was a jumbled mess of confusion, curiosity, and something else I didn't want to admit to myself. Why had I just sat there? Why hadn't I pulled my hand away? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? The following days were awkward, to say the least. I avoided being alone with her as much as possible, finding excuses to stay in my room or leave the house whenever I could, but no matter how hard I tried to avoid her, there was no escaping the tension that hung between us like a dark cloud. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the couch, the way her hand had felt on mine, the way her voice had sounded so intimate. And then one evening things escalated. It was late, and I had been trying to finish up some homework when she knocked on my door. My heart skipped a beat as I called out, "Come in." She stepped inside, looking a little unsure of herself, which was unusual for her. "Hey," she said softly, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure if she should come in all the way. "Can you help me with something in the garage?" I hesitated for a moment. Being alone with her felt like stepping into dangerous territory, but I couldn't exactly say no. "Sure," I said, standing up and following her down the hallway. The garage was cold and dimly lit, the only light coming from a single overhead bulb. She led me to a stack of boxes, talking about how she needed to organize them, but her words sounded distant. My mind was too focused on the way the air between us seemed to crackle with tension as we stood side by side moving boxes around. I could feel the space between us shrinking even though we hadn't moved any closer physically. It was like there was this unspoken pull drawing us together, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was becoming impossible to deny. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye and our gazes met for just a second, but in that second something shifted. There was something in her eyes, something vulnerable and raw, and it made my stomach flip. Without warning, she stepped closer. Her hand brushed against mine, sending a jolt through my entire body. I froze, unsure of what to do, my mind screaming at me to step back, to say something, to stop this, but I didn't move. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, and then in a voice barely above a whisper she said, "I've been thinking about you a lot." My heart pounded in my chest, and I didn't know how to respond. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words got stuck in my throat. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, and then, before I knew what was happening, she leaned in. The space between us disappeared in an instant, and I could feel her breath on my skin, warm and soft. My mind went blank as her lips hovered just inches from mine, and in that moment everything else faded away. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but there was no stopping what was happening. Not anymore. The next few moments felt like a blur, as if time itself had slowed down, trapping me in this real space where everything was happening too quickly and yet not fast enough. Her face was so close to mine, her breath warm on my skin, and for the first time in my life I wasn't sure what was real anymore. My thoughts were tangled, a confusing mess of emotions that I couldn't even begin to sort through. All I knew was that something irreversible was about to happen, and there was no stopping it. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching, waiting for some kind of sign, some kind of permission that I wasn't sure I was ready to give. But before I could think, before I could even react, her lips pressed against mine, soft, hesitant, but undeniably there. It wasn't like anything I'd ever felt before. My entire body tensed as the reality of the moment crashed over me, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. There was something magnetic, something unspoken between us that kept me frozen in place. It was only for a second, but in that second the world seemed to shift. Everything around us faded, the garage, the boxes, the cold air, none of it mattered anymore. All that existed was the feeling of her lips against mine, gentle yet overwhelming, like something I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. When she pulled back, her eyes were wide, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place, fear, confusion, maybe even regret. But then, before I could say anything, before I could process what had just happened, she kissed me again. This time there was no hesitation. It was deeper, more intense, and suddenly everything felt more real, more dangerous. I felt my heart racing, pounding so loudly in my ears that I was sure she could hear it too, but I still didn't pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning into the kiss, my mind spinning as I tried to make sense of what was happening. It was as if some invisible barrier between us had shattered, and now there was no turning back. The intensity of the moment grew, our breaths quickening as the seconds ticked by. There was a strange kind of desperation in the way she held on to me, like she was afraid to let go, like she needed this as much as I did. But there was no time to think about that, no time to question the feelings surging through me. All I could do was feel caught in the storm of emotions that had suddenly taken over, and then without warning we stumbled backward, out of the garage and into the house. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us, louder than any words could have been. It was like we both knew what was coming next, but neither of us had the courage to say it out loud. We ended up in the living room, the same place where all of this had started. The dim light from the TV cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel even more surreal. My pulse quickened as she stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. Her hand found mine again, fingers intertwining in a way that felt both strange and familiar. There was a brief moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She leaned in again, her lips finding mine with a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. Her body was against my body, and we were intertwined in each other and lost in that moment. It was different now, more intense, more certain. Time seemed to blur after that. I wasn't sure how long we stood there, wrapped up in each other, lost in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. There was no thinking, no rationalizing, just pure emotion. Every breath, every movement felt like a step further into uncharted territory, but neither of us stopped. At some point we found ourselves on the couch, the soft fabric beneath us a sharp contrast to the intensity of the moment. Everything was moving so fast, and yet it all felt too slow, like time had distorted around us. Her lips never left mine, and I could feel the weight of everything we weren't saying pressing down on us. This was happening, and it wasn't something we could just walk away from anymore. But even as it all unfolded, there was a part of me that still couldn't fully comprehend it. How had we gotten here? How had things escalated so quickly? I knew this was wrong, I knew that, but in the heat of the moment none of that seemed to matter. The only thing that mattered was the way her touch made my skin tingle, the way every kiss and touch sent a shock of electricity through me. There was no turning back now. We had crossed a line, one that neither of us could uncross, and yet in that moment it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like something we had been tiptoeing around for days, maybe even weeks, and now that it was happening there was no stopping it. I don't know how long we stayed there, lost in each other. Time seemed to have no meaning anymore. It could have been minutes or it could have been hours. All I knew was that when I finally pulled back, gasping for air, my mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts all at once, but none of those thoughts were enough to overpower the pull I still felt toward her. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions that I couldn't begin to unravel. For a moment we just stared at each other, both of us trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could say anything, before I could even think of the right words, she kissed me again. It wasn't like the other kisses. This one was softer, slower, filled with something deeper. Something more than just physical attraction. It was like she was trying to tell me something without words, trying to make me understand what neither of us had the courage to say out loud. And in that moment I felt it too. Her hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss grew more intense, the air around us thick with the weight of the moment. We moved together in a quiet rhythm, the world outside forgotten as we let ourselves get lost in each other. It wasn't rushed but filled with a tenderness that made my heart race, a connection that felt both familiar and new. The warmth of her body against mine was grounding, comforting, and for the first time in a while I felt completely present, caught in the intimacy of the moment. We didn't speak after that. There were no words that could capture what had just happened, no way to explain the emotions swirling around us like a storm. We just sat there side by side, the silence between us heavy with the weight of everything we weren't saying. As the night wore on, the intensity of the moment began to fade, replaced by a quiet, almost peaceful stillness. I could feel her head resting against my shoulder, her breathing slow and steady, and for the first time in hours my mind began to quiet. But even as the calm settled over us, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, stepped into territory that neither of us had been prepared for, and while the night might have ended in silence, the unspoken truth hung heavy between us. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. There would be consequences, there always are, but in that moment as we sat together in the dim light of the living room, none of that seemed to matter. All that mattered was that something had shifted, something had changed, and there was no going back. The rest of the night passed in a blur of quiet moments, a whirlwind of emotions and everything that we couldn't control. We didn't talk about what had happened, but it was undeniable. Everything had happened and we had let it. There was no making sense of it, no explaining the rush of feelings or the decisions we made. We simply existed in the silence, letting the weight of the night settle around us, both of us fully aware that tomorrow would bring its own set of challenges, its own set of questions we weren't ready to face. But for now, in the quiet of the night, all that mattered was this, all that mattered was us. The next morning came too soon. I woke up to the soft light filtering through the curtains, illuminating the quiet living room where I had spent the night. The stillness of the room, contrasted against the whirlwind of emotions from the night before, made the reality of everything sink in even deeper. My mom wasn't there anymore. At some point she must have left, but the weight of her presence lingered like a shadow hanging over me. I sat up slowly, the events of the previous night rushing back like a tidal wave, overwhelming and unavoidable. Everything had changed between us, and there was no escaping it. I couldn't pretend it didn't happen, couldn't act like life was going to just go back to the way it was before. The silence in the house was almost suffocating. I stood up and wandered to the kitchen, half expecting to find her there, maybe making breakfast, maybe waiting for me like nothing had happened. But the room was empty. The house felt empty, and for a brief moment I wasn't sure whether that was a relief or another layer of tension to add to the pile. I poured myself a glass of water, the cool liquid doing nothing to calm the storm inside of me. My mind was racing, a mess of tangled thoughts that I couldn't seem to untangle. What had we done? What was going to happen now? The questions were endless, and I didn't have a single answer. It wasn't long before I heard her footsteps in the hallway, soft but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to see her standing there, her expression unreadable. For a moment neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with the weight of unspoken words, the tension palpable. "Good morning," she finally said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Morning," I replied, my throat dry, the word coming out more strained than I intended. I wanted to say something more, to ask her what was going on in her head, but the words wouldn't come. Everything felt too raw, too fragile. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing how to navigate the aftermath of what had happened. It was like we were both stuck in a moment that we didn't know how to move past. The silence stretched on, each second heavier than the last. Finally she broke the silence. "I've been thinking about last night," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the uncertainty she felt about what happened. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. This was the conversation I had been dreading, and yet it was inevitable. We couldn't just ignore it, couldn't pretend that nothing had changed. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Me too." There was a long pause, and I could see the conf in her eyes, the way she was struggling to find the right words to make sense of something that didn't make any sense at all. "I don't know how we got here," she admitted, her voice breaking just slightly. "I don't know what any of this means." I didn't know either. All I knew was that something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. "Neither do I," said honestly, "but we can't pretend like nothing happened." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "I know," she whispered, "I don't want to." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded with meaning. We were both standing on the edge of something we didn't fully understand, but there was no turning back now. The line had been crossed, and whether we wanted to or not, we had to face whatever came next. I don't know what to do now," I said, my voice shaky. "Everything feels so different," she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It is different," she agreed, "but we'll figure it out. We have to." Her words, though meant to be comforting, didn't do much to calm the storm raging inside of me. There was no road map for this, no way to predict what would happen next. All I knew was that we had stepped into something far more complicated, aided than either of us had anticipated. The day passed in a strange kind of haze. We both went through the motions, cooking, cleaning, pretending to do things that needed doing, but the tension between us never faded. It was like an unspoken agreement that neither of us would bring up what had happened, at least not yet. We were both too scared to confront it, too scared of what it might mean, but as the hours dragged on, it became clear that we couldn't avoid it forever. The weight of the situation hung over us like a dark cloud, impossible to ignore. Every glance, every small interaction felt loaded with the memory of what had happened the night before, and neither of us knew how to move past it. Later that evening we found ourselves in the living room again, sitting on opposite sides of the couch. The silence between us was deafening, the air thick with unspoken words. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to say something, had to break the silence before it suffocated me. "I don't know where we go from here," I said suddenly, my voice cutting through the quiet. "But we can't keep pretending like everything's normal, because it's not." She didn't respond right away, her eyes focused on some invisible point in the distance. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost resigned. "I know," she said quietly, "but I don't know how to fix this." Her words hit me harder than I expected. The realization that there might not be a way to fix this, that what had happened might have changed everything, was a sobering thought. I didn't want to think about what that meant, didn't want to face the reality that there might not be a way to go back to how things were. "I don't either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe we just need some time," she suggested, "to think, to figure out what we both want." I wasn't sure if time was the answer, but it was the only solution we had at the moment. "Yeah," I agreed quietly. Maybe the silence settled over us once again, but this time it felt different. There was a finality to it, an understanding that we couldn't move forward until we had taken the time to process everything. It was a temporary pause, a moment to breathe before we had to face whatever came next. As the night wore on, we sat there, side by side but worlds apart. The distance between us had never felt so vast, and yet there was still an unspoken connection, a thread that tied us together, even if neither of us knew where it would lead. Eventually she stood up, breaking the quiet once more. "I'm going to bed," she said softly, her voice carrying an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "Yeah, me too," I replied, though I knew sleep would be the last thing on my mind. She lingered for a moment as if she wanted to say something more, but in the end she just gave me a small nod and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat there for a long time after she left, the weight of the day pressing down on me. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know how we were going to navigate this strange new reality, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, stepped into territory that was more complicated than either of us could have imagined, and now we were left to deal with the consequences. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, and for the first time in a long while I felt completely at peace.